The cold metal of the scissors bit into the thick fabric of his combat trousers, the sound unnaturally loud in the relative quiet. Specialist Liam Cooper worked with a focus born of repetition, cutting away the blood-soaked material from Corporal Madison's leg. The air in the casualty collection point, a small sandbagged depression in the earth, was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and the coppery tang of blood. Around him, the controlled chaos of a battlefield aid station hummed, the steady beep of a heart monitor, the curt professional tones of the other medics, the distant percussive thump of artillery. Madison, a young Marine from Ohio with a face still carrying the softness of youth, gripped the sides of the stretcher, his knuckles white. He wasn't screaming. He was just staring at the ceiling of the tent, his jaw tight, a low animalistic groan escaping his clenched teeth every few seconds. The shrapnel from the IED had torn a ragged, ugly wound through his thigh, severing muscle and nicking the femoral artery. Coop had already packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, the pressure his primary tool to stem the tide of red that wanted to claim the young man's life. "You're doing good, Madison," Coop said, his voice calm, a practiced steadiness that belied the frantic pace of his own heart. He didn't look at the Marine's face, his eyes fixed on the wound. "Just a scratch. You'll be telling your grandkids about this one day. Grandpa got a boo-boo in the desert. They'll be so impressed." A weak, breathy laugh escaped Madison's lips, cut short by a wince. "Hurts like a bitch, Doc." "I know," Coop said, gently probing the wound, on his fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had memorized every major vessel and nerve bundle. He reached for a fresh bandage. "Pain means you're alive. It's the quiet ones we have to worry about. Now hold still." Coop was a field medic, a title he wore with a quiet, unassuming pride. He wasn't a SEAL, not a member of the Tier 1 operators who were the main event on this mission. He was support. The Doc, they called him. A title that was part medical professional, part unit mascot, and part guardian angel. He was there to patch them up so they could get back to the business of being the tip of the spear. He was comfortable in that role. He didn't need the glory, the recognition, the secret handshakes. He just needed to keep his boys alive. He glanced at the clock on the wall of the tent, and it had been 3 hours since the QRF had brought them in. The main assault force, a mixed unit of Army Rangers and a small DEV-GRU element, was pushing deeper into the Shah-i-Khat Valley. His job was to stay here, stabilize the wounded, and prepare them for the medevac birds that would hopefully come once the weather cleared. He'd heard the radio chatter about the growing intensity of the contact. Objective Ginger, they were calling it. A fierce firefight had erupted. The casualty count they feared was about to rise. The radio crackled, a burst of static followed by a strained voice. "Bravo 6-1. This is medevac control. We have multiple urgent casualties at your location. An H-60 is en route. ETA 20 mics. Can you hold?" Coop's senior NCO, a gruff sergeant first class named Miller, grabbed the handset. "Copy control. We are prepped and ready. Just get them here." He put the handset down, exchanging a look with Coop. 20 minutes. That was an eternity in a combat zone. They were a forward aid station, not a field hospital. Their supplies were limited. The next 10 minutes passed, in a blur of minor treatments, a ranger with a concussion from a close blast, his pupils sluggish, another with minor burns on his hands. Coop moved from patient to patient, a one-man whirlwind of care, checking vitals, changing dressings, offering quiet words of encouragement. He was just finishing up with the ranger when the ground outside the tent erupted. It wasn't the distant crump of artillery or the crack of small arms fire. It was a sudden, overwhelming storm of sound, the frantic pounding of boots, the strained shouts of men, and the heavy, belabored breathing of exhaustion. Coop froze for a second, his hand instinctively going to the aid bag always slung over his shoulder. The canvas flap of the tent was ripped aside, and a man stumbled in. He was a giant, even hunched over. A SEAL by the look of his gear, his face streaked with camouflage paint and grime, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic energy. Draped over his shoulders was another man, limp and heavy. Behind him, the tent flap stayed open, revealing a scene of utter chaos. Two more men were being half-carried, half-dragged into the small space. They weren't walking wounded. They were broken. The giant gently, impossibly gently for a man his size, laid his burden down on the nearest empty stretcher. The man on it was pale, deathly pale, his uniform a tattered mess of blood and mud. A tourniquet was cinched high on his thigh, but blood had still managed to pool beneath him. Coop's training kicked in, shoving the shock aside. He moved towards the stretcher. "What do we have?" he asked, his voice crisp, all trace of his earlier fatigue gone. The SEAL, his chest heaving, just stared at him for a moment, his eyes unfocused. He looked like he had just run a marathon through hell. "IED," he finally managed, his voice a ragged whisper. Then we got hit. Ambush. RPG. We had to get them out." Coop's eyes swept the tent. There were 4 of them, 4 severely wounded operators. He saw another with a sucking chest wound, the telltale hiss of air escaping from a hole in his torso. A third had a catastrophic injury to his arm, the bone protruding at a sickening angle. The fourth, and the one the giant had carried in, was the worst. His vital signs were faint, his breathing shallow and erratic. The SEALs who had carried them in, 4 of them including the giant, stood by the entrance, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They looked at Coop, their gazes a mixture of desperate hope and grim expectation. They had done their job. They had gotten their brothers to safety. Now it was up to him. The distant sound of the medevac helicopter, once a beacon of hope, suddenly felt impossibly far away. Coop looked at the 4 mangled bodies before him. He looked at his limited supplies. He looked at Sergeant Miller, whose face was a mask of controlled panic. The 20-minute ETA stretched before him like an impossible gulf. He took a deep breath, the dusty air filling his lungs. And the title, "Only a Field Medic," dissolved in that moment. He was no longer just support. He was the only thing standing between these 4 men and the abyss. He turned to the exhausted SEALs. "Get me more light, and find me every clean bandage and IV bag you can carry." The order was sharp, immediate. The giant and his teammates snapped to it without a word. The real work, the desperate, chaotic, life-or-death work, had just begun. He looked back at the man with the chest wound. His hands moved, already reaching for an occlusive dressing and some tape. There was no time to think. There was only time to act. The tent became a crucible. Coop moved from man to man, a blur of focused energy. He worked on the SEAL with the chest wound first, slapping an occlusive dressing over the hole, detaping it on 3 sides to create a one-way valve that would let air out, but not in. The hissing stopped. The man's breathing, while still labored, became less frantic. He moved to the one with the shattered arm, immobilizing it with a splint, his movements gentle but firm. He could do little else for it here. It would require a surgeon. But his mind, a cold, calculating machine in the midst of the storm, kept drifting back to the 4th man, the one the giant had carried in. He was the priority, the one most likely to slip away. Coop finally knelt beside him. Up close, the damage was even worse than he'd feared. The tourniquet on his leg was tight, but the bleeding was internal. His abdomen was rigid, a classic sign of internal hemorrhage. His pulse was thready, his blood pressure dangerously low. Yet he was bleeding out into his own belly. Coop's heart sank. This was beyond his skills, beyond the capabilities of this tent. He needed a surgeon, a fully equipped operating room, and units of blood he didn't have. He started a large-bore IV, hanging a bag of Hespon, a plasma expander, to try and maintain some blood pressure. It was a stopgap, a tiny dam in a raging river. He knew it wasn't enough. He looked at the man's face. He was young, maybe even younger than Madison. His name tape read Jensen. The giant, who Coop now noticed was called Tex on his body armor, knelt opposite him. "How is he, Doc?" The question was raw, stripped of all military bravado. Coop didn't sugarcoat it. "Bad. He's bleeding internally. I can't stop it here. He needs a surgeon, and he needs one now." He looked at Tex. I'm seeing the hope drain from the man's eyes. "The bird is still 10 minutes out." 10 minutes. For a man with a major abdominal hemorrhage, it might as well be 10 hours. Coop looked around the tent. The other three were as stable as he could make them. The man with the chest wound was propped up, breathing easier. The one with the arm was sedated. Madison, his own wound forgotten, was watching the scene with wide, terrified eyes. The SEALs who had carried them in stood like statues, their faces etched with a profound and helpless grief. An idea, insane and desperate, began to form in Coop's mind. It was born of pure frustration, of the gut-wrenching feeling of standing by while a man died in front of him. He looked at Tex. "The LZ," he said, his voice low and intense. "Where is the designated LZ?" Tex blinked, so confused by the sudden question. It's about a click south of here. Open field. Why?" Coop's mind raced. A click. 1,000 meters. Over rough, uneven terrain, through wadis and rocky outcroppings. The medevac wouldn't come to them. The pilots had their orders, a pre-coordinated landing zone deemed safe enough for the fragile helicopter. They would hover there, a tempting target for any insurgent with a rocket-propelled grenade, for the absolute minimum amount of time. They wouldn't wait. If the patients weren't there, they would leave. And Jensen didn't have 10 minutes to wait for a litter team to be organized, to carefully load him onto a stretcher, and to slowly carry him 1,000 meters. He had minutes, period. The thought crystallized in Coop's mind with terrifying clarity. He looked at the IV pole, at the bag of Hespon slowly dripping its life-sustaining fluid into Jensen's arm. He looked at his own 2 hands. He was a field medic. He was trained to treat, not to haul. But the definition of his job, the unspoken oath he had taken, was suddenly very simple. Do whatever it takes. He stood up, his legs feeling strangely weak. "Tex," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the tent. "Help me get him on my back." Tex stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "The LZ is a click away. He doesn't have 10 minutes. I'm going to carry him there. Now." Coop was already moving, crouching beside Jensen. "Get the IV bag. Hold it high. Don't let the line kink." For a second, no one moved. The idea was so preposterous, so physically impossible, that it didn't register. A field medic, a man of average height and build, it carrying a fully grown, unconscious man in full combat gear for a kilometer over hostile terrain? It was a suicide march. It was absurd. Then something in Coop's eyes, a fierce, unyielding determination that burned brighter than the desert sun, silenced all doubt. Tex moved. He was a SEAL, trained to assess and execute the most impossible missions. And in this moment, his mission was clear. Follow the doc. Tex and another SEAL gently but swiftly maneuvered Jensen onto Coop's back. The weight was crushing. 180 pounds of dead weight, plus gear, settled onto his shoulders, compressing his spine, making his knees buckle. Coop grunted, his face contorting with the strain. He could feel Jensen's shallow breath on his neck, a faint whisper of life against his skin. Tex carefully placed the IV bag in Coop's left hand, out his fingers wrapping around the cool plastic. "Okay," Coop breathed, the word a prayer and a declaration of war. He took one staggering step towards the tent flap. "Okay." He took another. The men inside the tent watched him go, frozen in a moment of stunned awe. Sergeant Miller opened his mouth to object, to point out the madness of it, but the words died in his throat. He simply watched as the unassuming field medic, bent under an impossible burden, walked out into the dust-choked twilight. The mission to save Jensen had just begun. The world outside the tent was a stark, brutal landscape of rock and shadow. The setting sun cast long, distorted shapes across the valley floor, turning every boulder into a potential enemy and every crevice into a yawning chasm. And the initial adrenaline that had propelled Coop out of the tent was already fading, replaced by the screaming protest of every muscle in his body. Jensen was a dead weight on his back, an inert mass that grew heavier with every step. Coop's boots, designed for stability, now felt like leaden anchors, each footfall a jarring impact that shot pain through his knees and up his spine. The IV bag was a constant, awkward presence in his left hand, its tube a fragile lifeline snaking over his shoulder. He had to hold it high, higher than Jensen's heart, a constant, draining isometric exercise for his arm. He set a rhythm in his head. One step, breathe. 2 steps, breathe. Don't think about the distance. Don't think about the pain. Just think about the next step. He focused on a jagged rock formation 100 meters ahead. Just get to the rock. Then, find the next landmark. Behind him, he could hear the heavy, labored breathing of the SEALs. Tex and 2 others had followed him without a word. They moved alongside him, a protective cordon, their eyes scanning the ridges, their weapons at the ready. They were his escort, his insurance policy against the enemy that lurked in the shadows. But they couldn't carry his burden. They couldn't share the weight. This was his alone. The terrain was a nightmare. The ground was uneven, a treacherous mix of hard-packed earth, loose shale, and sharp rocks that slid and shifted underfoot. Coop's ankles rolled constantly, sending fresh jolts of agony through his legs. He stumbled once, almost going down, his body lurching forward. He caught himself, his free hand slamming against a rock, scraping the skin raw. Jensen groaned weakly on his back, at a sound that was both terrifying and motivating. He was still alive. "Easy, Doc!" Tex's voice was a low growl in his ear. "We got you! Just keep moving!" Keep moving. Those 2 words became Coop's mantra, his only reality. The world narrowed to the small patch of ground directly in front of his feet. The distant sound of gunfire, the occasional crack of a sniper's round, faded into a dull background hum. The sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, mixing with the dust to form a gritty paste on his skin. His breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as if filled with acid. 500 meters. He didn't know how he knew, but he felt it. A milestone. Halfway. But the halfway point brought no relief. It only brought the horrifying realization that he had to do it all over again. His legs were trembling now, and his muscles quivering with the effort of simply standing upright. The weight on his back felt like a mountain. He could feel Jensen's body slipping slightly, his grip on the man's arms weakening. "Stop," he gasped, his voice a dry croak. The SEALs instantly froze, dropping to a knee, their weapons sweeping the area. Coop shifted Jensen's weight, hitching him higher onto his back. He could feel the man's blood, sticky and warm, seeping through his own uniform, plastering his shirt to his skin. The sight of it, the feel of it, was a fresh jolt of terror. He was bleeding again. The movement was making it worse. He looked at the IV bag. It was still hanging, still dripping. But for how long? How much blood could a man lose and still cling to life? He didn't have the answer, and that lack of knowledge was the most terrifying thing of all. He started moving again, but now there was a new element to his private hell: fear. Not fear for himself, but a cold, sharp fear that he wouldn't make it. That despite everything, Jensen would die on his back, within sight of the helicopters that could save him. The thought was unbearable. It was a failure he couldn't allow. He started talking. At first, it was just a mumble, a stream of consciousness meant to distract himself from the pain. But then it became a message, directed at the man whose life he was carrying. "Come on, Jensen," he rasped, his voice a low, rhythmic chant timed with his footsteps. "You hear me? You're not dying today. Not on my watch. You're a SEAL, right? The best of the best. You've been through Hell Week. You've been through Bud/S. This is nothing. This is just a little hike. A walk in the park. So you hold on. You hear me? You hold on for Tex. You hold on for your team. You hold on for me." He didn't know if Jensen could hear him. He didn't know if his words were reaching the fading consciousness behind those closed eyelids. But they were reaching Coop himself. They were fueling his resolve, feeding the fire in his soul that refused to let him quit. He was a conduit, a vessel for the man's life, and he would not, could not, fail. 700 meters. The terrain grew even steeper, forcing him to scramble up a rocky incline on his hands and knees, Jensen's weight threatening to topple him backwards with every movement. One of the SEALs, a quiet man named Roberts, moved in front of him, grabbing his free arm and pulling him upward, providing a crucial counterweight. They moved as a single, desperate organism, at a chain of human will fighting against the brutal indifference of the mountains. 800 meters. Coop's vision was starting to blur, black spots dancing at the edges. The pain was no longer localized, it was a total, all-encompassing ocean of agony that washed over him. He was beyond exhaustion. He was running on fumes, on willpower, on the sheer, stubborn refusal to let a man die. He was no longer a field medic. He was a pack mule, a beast of burden driven by a force far stronger than his own body. 900 meters. In the distance, he saw it. A flicker of light, then another. The landing zone. It was a flat, open area, and in the fading light, he could make out the dark shapes of the medevac helicopter on the ground, its rotors still turning. A ghost